In a cold stone hall lit by flickering torches, a nobleman slices into a roasted swan gilded with gold leaf. Below, in a muddy village shack, a peasant gnaws stale rye bread beside a pot of watery pottage. 2 meals, 2 worlds, 1 kingdom. This isn't just about food. It's about survival, status, and power. What the rich feasted on, and what the poor endured, reveals a world built on staggering inequality and rigid control. Tonight, we set the medieval table on both sides of it. In medieval Europe, food was never just sustenance. It was identity. It was power, and above all, it was separation. From the stone halls of manors to the mud floors of village huts, what one ate and how often was not a matter of personal preference, but of status locked in bloodlines and land. A lord's table groaned with meat, spice, and imported wine. A peasant's bowl, by contrast, held watery gruel, hard bread, and whatever root vegetables could survive a fickle growing season. Between the two lay an unbridgeable chasm that mirrored the social order of the time. The medieval world was rigidly hierarchical. At the top stood the nobility and clergy landholders, who owed their privilege to lineage or divine appointment. Below them were the vast majority, peasants, villeins, and serfs, whose lives were governed by toil and whose stomachs were governed by scarcity. Food revealed this hierarchy with stunning clarity. Wealth granted access to wheat, sugar, exotic fruits, and spices shipped from Asia and North Africa. The poor subsisted on barley, oats, and cabbage, relying on a diet almost entirely devoid of animal protein. Feasting was more than indulgence. It was political theater. Noble banquets were occasions to demonstrate dominance and generosity, often staged after military victories, royal marriages, or religious festivals. The extravagance on display whole roasted animals, gilded pies, and elaborate sugar sculptures was a calculated performance. It reminded guests and servants alike of where power resided. Food was not merely consumed. It was displayed, paraded, and weaponized in the hierarchy of appearances. For the common laborer, hunger was routine. The average peasant consumed fewer calories than they expended, especially during planting and harvest seasons. Malnutrition was widespread, particularly among children, and famine was a regular visitor. A failed crop or poor harvest could spiral into regional catastrophe. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, tens of thousands across northern Europe died not from war or disease, but from empty fields and empty stomachs. The Church reinforced this order. Religious fasts limited meat consumption for all, but nobles could afford substitutions, fish, eggs, dairy, while the poor simply went without. The calendar of saints and holy days further regimented eating habits, yet always in a way that the wealthy could sidestep with loopholes the poor could not afford. What a person ate in the Middle Ages was determined before they were born by class, by land, by inheritance. There was no mobility through food, only reinforcement. Bread made from white wheat was a luxury. Black rye or oat loaves marked one's low station as clearly as a chain or a title ever could. To understand medieval society, one need only examine the table. On it was not just sustenance, but a map of the world as they knew it, divided, unequal, and enforced by appetite. In the great halls of medieval Europe, a noble feast was not simply a meal, it was a statement, a demonstration of wealth, lineage, and authority. The lords of the realm did not dine to satisfy hunger alone. They orchestrated spectacles of abundance, designed to impress allies, intimidate rivals, and reinforce the social order etched into the very stones of their estates. A typical noble banquet, especially between the 12th and 15th centuries, could last hours. Multiple courses, sometimes numbering over 10, were carried in by servants in precise order, each dish more elaborate than the last. At the height of the High Middle Ages, such meals often began with roasted swans or peacocks, served with feathers reattached to their bodies, dyed and lacquered to shimmer under torchlight. These birds were rarely eaten for taste. They were served as symbols of magnificence and dominion over nature. The main courses featured meats that only the wealthiest could access in large quantities: venison, wild boar, goose, partridge, and sometimes exotic imports like crane or even dolphin, classified as fish under church law. The meat was heavily seasoned not because it was spoiled, as once assumed, but because the use of spices itself was a flex of wealth. Saffron from Persia, cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from the Moluccas, and pepper from India traveled through long, dangerous trade routes. To pour them liberally over a dish was to remind every guest of one's access to global commerce and imperial networks. Wine flowed constantly. Nobles in France or England might serve clarets from Bordeaux or sweet wines imported from the Rhineland or Mediterranean ports. Beer was considered too rustic for such occasions. Silver goblets, often engraved with heraldic symbols, passed from hand to hand. Forks were rare, and food was eaten using knives and fingers, with water basins brought between courses for washing. Desserts were equally theatrical. Marchpane, sweet almond paste molded into intricate shapes, was used to form castles, animals, or scenes from mythology. Sugar sculptures stood as tall as a man. One feast in the court of Charles VI of France in the late 14th century reportedly featured a mechanical lion that moved across the table, roaring as it presented a plate of gilded pastries. These events were more than indulgence. They were calculated exercises in power projection. A baron might host a feast after winning a land dispute, marrying into a wealthier family, or receiving a royal charter. By feeding hundreds, sometimes thousands, the noble confirmed his control over the land's bounty and its people. Vassals who dined well were reminded of their place and loyalty. Those left out were equally reminded of their exclusion. Preparation involved dozens of staff kitchen boys, bakers, butchers, spice handlers, and stewards. The great kitchens of estates like Westminster, the Château de Vincennes, or the castles of Aragon were industrial centres unto themselves, often rivaling small villages in size and scale. At major royal feasts, such as those under Edward III of England or Philip the Bold of Burgundy, records show the slaughter of hundreds of animals and the importation of entire shiploads of wine and delicacies. These feasts reflected the ideological core of medieval aristocracy, that divine order justified excess at the top and scarcity below. The spectacle of the Lord's table was not merely about consumption. It was about reinforcing hierarchy through sight, sound, and scent, and leaving no doubt about who ruled and who served. Across 13th century Europe, the average peasant's diet was governed not by preference, but by necessity. For the rural poor, who made up over 90% of the population, meals were determined by the soil, the season, and the unpredictable rhythm of weather and harvest. What they ate reflected centuries of subsistence living, shaped by communal obligations, church mandates, and the relentless demands of feudal labor. The cornerstone of peasant food was pottage, a thick, boiling stew of whatever ingredients were available: barley, oats, beans, leeks, cabbage, or garlic. cooked slowly over open hearths in iron cauldrons. Pottage was eaten daily, often multiple times a day, served with coarse black bread made from rye or maslina, mixture of rye and wheat. For many, this simple stew was the beginning and end of every meal. Meat was rare. Most peasants lived under manorial laws that restricted hunting rights, reserving forests and game for lords and clergy. Unauthorized hunting, known as poaching, was punishable by fines, mutilation, or even death. Domestic animals like chickens or pigs were kept, but they were more valuable alive for eggs, manure, or breeding than on the plate. When meat was eaten, it was typically during festivals, weddings, or seasonal slaughter periods, often shared communally and stretched into broths. Dairy, though more accessible, remained limited. Cows and goats were milked, but much of the milk was used to make butter or hard cheeses that could be stored. Eggs were not sold for tax obligations or traded at market, offered a modest source of protein. Fish, particularly herring and eel, became increasingly important, especially during religious fasts when meat was prohibited. Preserved in salt or dried, these fish were distributed via trade networks that extended as far as the North Sea and the Baltic. Malnutrition was common. Most peasants consumed a heavily carbohydrate-based diet that lacked diversity and vital nutrients. Scurvy, rickets, and other deficiency-related conditions were widespread but rarely understood. Infant mortality, rates, were high, even in stable years. It was a struggle to maintain the calories required for physically demanding labor, plowing, harvesting, weaving, hauling. Food insecurity was not episodic. It was embedded in the structure of medieval life. A poor harvest, late frost, or local conflict could decimate supplies. Granaries were small and exposed. Rats and spoilage were constant threats. In the worst case, as such as the Great European Famine of 1315 to 1317, just decades after this period, chronic hunger collapsed into outright starvation. During these years, prolonged rain and crop failure led to widespread food shortages. Chroniclers across England, France, and the Low Countries recorded people eating roots, bark, and even the flesh of the dead. Though these years fell just outside the 13th century, they were preceded by repeated local famines and shortages that prepared no one for disaster. The Church imposed over 140 fasting days per year, including Lent and Advent. For the wealthy, these were formalities. For the poor, they added an additional layer of strain to an already meager diet. Yet despite scarcity, food was never just. Biologically, it carried meaning. Meals were shared in families, blessed by priests, and woven into village customs. Even among hardship, ritual and repetition gave structure to the struggle. In the fields and hearths of 13th century Europe, survival was measured in loaves, ladles, and luck. What the peasant ate when they could eat reflected the fragile balance of climate, class, and control. Hunger was not a moment, it was a system. In medieval Europe, spices were more than flavor. They were status, symbolism, and economic power condensed into grains, roots, and bark. On noble tables, the presence of saffron, cinnamon, ginger, and black pepper was not merely a culinary choice, was a declaration of wealth and reached by the 13th century. Spices had become a staple of elite cuisine across Western Europe. These ingredients did not grow locally. Black pepper came from India, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, cloves and nutmeg from the Malaccas, modern-day Indonesia. Saffron, the dried stigma of a crocus flower, was cultivated in limited pockets across the Islamic world and southern Europe, but remained expensive to harvest and transport. The rarity of these items elevated them beyond food and into the realm of political signaling. Trade routes were the arteries that delivered this prestige. Spices traveled thousands of kilometers overland via the Silk Road, through ports in Alexandria, Acre, or Constantinople, and across the Mediterranean into Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa. From there, merchants distributed them northward, commanding prices that could rival silver by weight. The price of a single pound of saffron in London during the 14th century could equal a labourer's monthly wage. For the nobility, spices were incorporated into almost every course of a formal meal. Meat, fish, pastries, and even wine were infused with combinations of sweet and pungent flavorings often unrecognizable to the modern palate. These concoctions were not based on taste as much as on spectacle. A dish seasoned with 4 or 5 imported spices suggested wealth not only in gold but in global connection. It demonstrated a household's access to distant merchants, maritime influence, and the ability to pay tariffs and tolls across kingdoms. Records from royal households underscore this trend. In 13th century England, the accounts of Henry III show regular purchases of large quantities of cumin, ginger, and pepper. In France, the Valois dukes of Burgundy kept extensive inventories of exotic spices, stored under lock and key in specialized cupboards, often managed by trusted stewards. Spices were valuable enough to be counted individually and distributed with caution. Theft from spice stores was treated as a serious offense. Their significance extended beyond the dining hall. Spices were gifted between kings and bishops, offered in dowries, and used in the anointing oils of coronations. Their trade fueled competition between empires. By the late medieval period, the high value of the spice trade helped justify expeditions along the West African coast, eventually leading to Portuguese ventures around the Cape of Good Hope. Even conflict was shaped by these commodities. The capture of key ports in the eastern Mediterranean during the Crusades was not only about religious or territorial gains, it also offered access to spice markets. Control over Levantine trade hubs meant control over the distribution of the most prized items in Europe's kitchens and apothecaries, for those who could afford them. Spices reinforced hierarchy. Their scent and taste reminded every guest of the host's authority. For those who could not, the absence was just as loud. In the medieval world, power could be measured in armies and land, but just as often it was measured in ounces of pepper. Beneath the grandeur of medieval feasts lay a world of smoke, sweat, and relentless labor. Behind every noble banquet hall stood a kitchen complex operating with military precision, staffed by dozens, sometimes hundreds of workers. Their task was monumental: to prepare elaborate meals for lords, ladies, guests, clergy, soldiers, and retainers, often 3 times a day, in conditions that were chaotic, hazardous, and unforgiving. In castles such as Kenilworth, Windsor, or the Palais des Papes in Avignon, the kitchen was more than a room. It was an industrial zone. The scale reflected the size of the household, which could include hundreds of people, from knights and squires to grooms, falconers, and laundresses. Feeding them required coordination across multiple departments: the pantry, buttery, larder, scullery, and bakehouse. Each had its own staff, rules, and storage. At the heart of the operation was the master cook, often a trusted servant or freedman, responsible for overseeing the entire process. Under him was Saucius, who prepared sauces from spices, herbs, and broths, roasters, who handled spits and open fires, and boilers, who worked over large cauldrons. Spit boys, typically young boys, rotated heavy roasting spits for hours beside roaring flames, exposed constantly to heat and smoke. Their task was so physically taxing that it left many with burns and lung damage. The scullery was the lowest, rung dealing with pots, bones, scraps, and endless cleaning. Floors were slick with grease, and vermin were constant. Open flames posed a daily threat, especially in wooden outbuildings. In 1298, a fire broke out in Edward I's kitchen at Westminster, destroying large portions of the palace. Such incidents were common. Kitchens were separated from main halls in many castles, not for convenience, but for fire prevention. Provisions were delivered daily, meat from nearby manorial farms, fish from rivers or markets, spices and wine stored under lock in guarded pantries were measured precisely. Waste was massive byproducts, dumped in pits or reused for animal feed. Nothing was casual. Every dish followed a strict sequence based on court etiquette and social rank. A visiting bishop did not receive the same food or in the same order as a minor knight. The buttery and cellar managed drinks, primarily ale and wine. The butler, despite the modern connotation, was a senior official responsible for distributing drink according to protocol. Theft, dilution, or misallocation of wine could lead to fines or dismissal. Every barrel had to be accounted for. Most of the labor was seasonal. During feast days, particularly Christmas, Easter, or royal visits, the pressure intensified. Accounts from the 14th century record kitchens preparing over 10,000 meals in a single week during coronation ceremonies or royal progresses. Temporary workers were brought in. Sleep became rare. Injuries were common. Despite the grueling nature of the work, kitchen service could offer a path to stability or even advancement. Skilled cooks who pleased their lords could rise in station, gaining access to patronage networks or clerical positions. In some cases, they earned property or royal favor, as seen in the records of Edward III's court. What appeared on the noble table was only the final product. Behind it was a machine of human effort, often invisible but essential. A castle's feast was not only a display of wealth, but of logistical power, the ability to command labor, supplies, and skill in the service of spectacle in medieval Europe. The feast was not merely a celebration, it was a calculated performance, a show of authority, hierarchy, and control. Rulers and nobles used food not only to nourish, but to influence. Each detail, seating, service, ingredients, sequence was meticulously arranged to reflect and reinforce power at royal coronations. Food functioned as political theatre. When Edward I was crowned King of England in 1274, over 3,000 dishes were served across multiple courses. Chroniclers noted how barons and knights dined according to strict protocol, while commoners were granted limited access to outer courtyards. The sheer abundance was intentional. It presented the new monarch not only as divinely appointed, but as materially capable to command resources, loyalty, and order on a national scale. Weddings between noble houses followed the same logic. When Charles VI of France married Isabeau of Bavaria in 1385, the celebrations lasted several days. The feasts featured exotic meats, sugar sculptures, and continuous entertainment. Food was one tool among many to bind rival families and display the legitimacy of the union. In public, The couple sat, elevated, flanked by clergy and court officials. Their meals served as a symbolic contract, witnessed and consumed by hundreds. Victory banquets were equally strategic. After the Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1302, the Flemish organized a series of grand feasts to commemorate their victory over the French. At these tables, wealth was not only flaunted, but moralized, portraying military success as divinely favored and the vanquished as morally inferior. Food became a medium for storytelling, reinforcing narratives of honor, divine right, and national pride. Presentation mattered. Dishes were choreographed for maximum effect. Entire animals were reconstructed after roasting. Birds sewn back into their plumage. Fish presented swimming in gelatin molds. A 15th century Burgundian banquet is recorded to have featured a dessert course in which live birds flew out of a pastry shell. Astonishment intended, symbolism clear. Control over nature, over servants, over spectacle, it all served to reinforce the status of the host. Every action at the table was a display of rank. Nobles were served in order of precedence. Specific cuts of meat were reserved for particular guests. The carving of a boar or swan required official training. Even the washing of hands before a meal followed formal ceremony, with scented water poured over the fingers of elite diners by assigned attendants. The message was constant. Order, hierarchy, and power were not suspended during a feast, they were magnified. Yet there was a calculated tension in this display. The abundance often bordered on excess. Gluttony, a deadly sin, lingered beneath the surface of every banquet. The Church condemned overindulgence, but its warnings were easily reinterpreted by the elite. In noble culture, extravagance was framed, not as vice, but as divine reward. Those who possessed were assumed to deserve. Those who watched, to submit. Guilt was displaced onto the guests, not the host. Attendees might reflect on their unworthiness to dine so richly, reinforcing their dependence and gratitude. Vassals were reminded of their inferior position. Rulers, in turn, could appear both generous and absolute. Feasts were never just about eating. They were about performance, persuasion, and reinforcement. They turned kitchens into stages, tables into altars, and courses into coded messages. In a world without mass communication, the medieval feast remained one of the most powerful forms of propaganda in medieval Europe. Food was not only governed by harvest and hierarchy, it was regulated by the Church. Eating was a spiritual act, bound to doctrine, discipline, and displays of piety. The Christian calendar imposed strict rules on what could be consumed and when, shaping diets across centuries and across every social class. Fasting was not optional. It was mandated by religious authority, rooted in the belief that self-denial purified the soul. Over 140 days each year were designated as meatless, most notably during Lent, Advent, and every Friday. On these days, the consumption of flesh from warm-blooded animals was forbidden. Meat became associated with bodily pleasure, excess, and sin. Abstaining from it was considered a form of spiritual control, a mortification of the flesh to align with Christ's suffering. For the lower classes, fasting often meant going hungry. Many peasants lacked access to alternatives. Meat was already rare in their diets, and when removed entirely, little remained beyond pottage and bread. In lean seasons, Lent could become a period of real deprivation, not symbolic sacrifice. Eggs and dairy were often restricted as well, depending on local interpretation, narrowing options even further. The wealthy, however, often found ways to comply without discomfort. Loopholes developed early. Aquatic animals were exempt from fasting laws, and church authorities had the discretion to classify borderline species. Beavers, for example, because of their aquatic habits, were declared acceptable. Dolphins and porpoises, though mammals, were labeled fish by some clerics. In royal courts, these were served on silver platters during Lent, with elaborate sauces. Sidestepping restriction while maintaining appearances of piety, the records of the ducal court of Burgundy and the English crown show that Lenten meals could still be extravagant. Salted fish, lampreys, almond milk sauces, and imported spices allowed the upper classes to transform fasting into a performance of refined virtue, not suffering. Some monastic orders did impose stricter rules, such as the Cistercians or Carthusians, but the aristocracy rarely embraced austerity with the same rigor. The Church not only enforced these norms, but profited from them. Dispensations could be purchased, allowing wealthy individuals to bypass fasting obligations entirely. In the 14th century, the papal court in Avignon issued thousands of such permissions annually, blending penitence with patronage. For the peasantry, there was no such relief. Their experience of religious dietary laws was inseparable from economic reality. Fasting compounded scarcity. For some, particularly during failed harvests, the mandated abstinence pushed their already fragile sustenance closer to collapse. Yet the Church's control over diet extended beyond disciplined, reinforced structure. Fasting created shared rhythms that ordered the year: Lent before Easter, Advent before Christmas, Saints' days in between. It unified society under a single moral clock. Whether one was starving or feasting, the rules around food were never just about faith. They marked class boundaries, institutional power, and the ability to interpret and manipulate law. What one ate or didn't eat said as much about their place in society as their place in heaven. In the spring of 1315, rain began to fall across northern Europe. It did not stop for months. Fields flooded, grain rotted in the ground, roads turned to sludge. By midsummer, panic had begun to spread, not from invading armies or disease, but from hunger. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 would become one of the deadliest food crises of the medieval era, exposing the fragility of a society entirely dependent on seasonal rhythms. Crop failure was widespread. Wheat, rye, barley, staples of both noble and peasant diets, could not be harvested or stored. Salt, needed to preserve meat and fish, washed away in flooded mines. Livestock weakened from soaked fodder and poor grazing. The price of food skyrocketed. In England, grain costs doubled by autumn. In Flanders, bread riots broke out. Chroniclers from Germany to France described empty marketplaces and children begging in the streets. The famine was not confined to the poor. Even nobles, insulated by wealth and stores, felt the shock. Their granaries ran dry. Hunting grounds yielded little. Servants fled in search of food elsewhere. Yet the experience was never equal. Lords had reserves, connections, and coin. Peasants had none. In many villages, entire families perished. Starvation forced people to eat bark, grass, and the meat of diseased animals. In some accounts, there were whispers of cannibalism. The famine struck hardest in densely populated regions, like the Low Countries and northern France. Cities such as Bruges and Paris saw mortality rise sharply, not from plague, but from simple caloric collapse. Infants born in these years rarely survived. The sick and elderly died first. The able-bodied followed when supplies ran out. Monasteries and churches tried to intervene. Some distributed food, others offered sanctuary, but they too depended on the same failed harvests. Their granaries emptied faster than they could be replenished. Across the Holy Roman Empire, bishops issued public fastnet to honor saints, but in desperate appeals for divine mercy. The famine lasted nearly 3 years. It was not continuous starvation, but a cycle of scarcity and false hope. A brief improvement in 1316 proved deceptive. The following year brought renewed rains and fresh failure. By the time normal harvests returned in 1318, the damage was irreversible. Tens of thousands had died. Many more had been displaced. Fields had been abandoned. Birth rates plummeted for years. This was not the failure of an isolated village. It was the breakdown of an entire system. Medieval Europe lacked the infrastructure to move food quickly or store it long-term. Roads were poor, carts slow, trade networks thin. There were no grain reserves large enough to feed entire regions. When local supplies failed, there was nowhere to turn. The Great Famine did more than kill it exposed. It revealed how narrow the margin of survival truly was. Lords and serfs alike depended on the same earth, the same skies, the same fragile link between seed and bread. But when that link broke, it was always the poorest who suffered first and longest. In medieval Europe, what one ate was never just a matter of taste. It was a reflection of one's rank, one's rights, and one's role within a system that was deliberately unequal. From the marble halls of lords to the thatched huts of serfs, the difference between abundance and hunger was not accidentally, was enforced by design. The food gap reinforced hierarchy at every level. Access to meat, spices, fish, and fine grains was restricted not only by wealth but by law and privilege. Game laws forbade peasants from hunting the forests they lived beside. Mills and ovens were often owned by the local lord, who charged peasants to grind their grain or bake their bread. Even gleaning the collection of leftover crops after harvest was sometimes criminalized. Survival required submission. Meals reflected submission, too. The nobility dined on white bread, roast meats, and wine imported from distant regions. The poor made do with dark rye, boiled vegetables, and small beer. When peasants did gather for communal meals at festivals or holy days, these were brief moments of relief, not regular sustenance. The gap between tables was a visible symbol of the larger social order, rigid, unequal, and rarely questioned without punishment. Inequality was not simply economic, it was internalized. The rich were taught that their wealth was ordained by God, their status reflected in their ability to afford delicacies, observe fasts without suffering, or host banquets as demonstrations of piety and power. The poor, by contrast, were told that hunger was a natural part of their earthly burdens, something to endure, not challenge. The psychology of hunger left deep scars. Chronic undernourishment, stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and shortened lifespans. But it also shaped the way people saw themselves and the world. For the peasantry, hunger bred anxiety, dependency, and in some cases, fatalism. For the elite, indulgence became a right one they rarely questioned, even as famines spread across their domains. Revolts did come. Food shortages were often the spark. In 1323, a rebellion in Flanders erupted partly over grain prices. In 1381, during the English Peasants' Revolt, Anger over taxation and labor laws mingled with decades of accumulated resentment over food. Yet each time the old order reasserted itself, landowners crushed dissent. Hunger returned, the legacy of medieval food. Inequality didn't end with the Middle Ages. It laid the groundwork for centuries of structural imbalance. Control over food meant control over labor, over bodies, over time. It's a pattern that reappeared in colonial plantations, industrial cities, and modern global markets. The mechanisms changed, but the outcomes remained hauntingly familiar. What filled the plate in the medieval world was never random. It was a consequence of power. A consequence that left the majority of the population one bad harvest away from collapse, and a small few feasting under banners of divine right. In the shadow of those tables, inequality was served daily and its aftertaste remains.